How does a man go from being a loving brother to the star witness who sends his own sister to the electric chair? This is the story of David Greenglass, a machinist on the top-secret Manhattan Project, who held the plans for the atomic bomb. Faced with prison for espionage, he made a devastating choice. He testified against his sister Ethel Rosenberg and her husband Julius. His words sealed their fate, creating a family tragedy that would echo for generations and expose a dark chapter in American justice. To see how this ultimate betrayal unfolded, subscribe for more incredible stories. David Greenglass grew up in the bustling, crowded world of New York's Lower East Side during the Great Depression. Life was a daily struggle for his working-class Jewish family, a reality that shaped the worldview of everyone in his orbit. He was not a remarkable student, lacking the intellectual fire and ambition that defined his older sister Ethel. She was the star of the family, bright and determined to make a life for herself beyond the tenements. David looked up to her, and his life was deeply intertwined with hers. That connection would ultimately define him, not for the brotherly affection he held, but for its catastrophic betrayal. When Ethel met and fell in love with a young electrical engineer named Julius Rosenberg, David's world gained a new, powerful gravitational center. Julius was everything. David was not charismatic, politically fervent, and intellectually confident. He and Ethel married in 1939, and their small apartment became a hub for young idealists who believed they had the answer to the world's problems. For them, the answer was communism. In an era of widespread poverty and rising fascism in Europe, the Soviet Union represented a bold experiment, a promise of a future free from class struggle and inequality. For a young man like David, who was good with his hands but lacked a clear direction, the powerful certainty of his brother-in-law was magnetic. Julius Rosenberg was not just his sister's husband, he was a mentor and a figure of authority. David, along with his own future wife Ruth Prince, was drawn into this circle, absorbing the political ideology that permeated every conversation and social gathering. The course of David's ordinary life was violently rerouted by the tide of global conflict. When the United States entered World War II, David Greenglass was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1943. While most young men were sent to basic training to become infantrymen, David's specific skills as a technically proficient machinist singled him out for a different path. The Army, in its vast and often impersonal wisdom, had a special need for men like him. He was not destined for the battlefields of Europe or the islands of the Pacific. Instead, he was sent into a world of profound secrecy, a place that existed on no public map and whose purpose was the most closely guarded secret of the war. First, he was stationed at the sprawling, hastily constructed facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Soon after, he was transferred to a location even more remote and more critical, a dusty, isolated mesa in the middle of the New Mexico desert. This was Los Alamos, the nerve center of the Manhattan Project. This top-secret wartime initiative had a singular, terrifying goal: to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could achieve the same. David was not one of the elite physicists like J. Robert Oppenheimer, who wrestled with the theoretical equations that would unlock the power of the atom. He was a blue-collar soldier, a vital cog in a colossal machine. His job was to help fabricate the intricate components for the weapon. Specifically, he worked on the high-explosive lens molds, the precisely shaped charges that would squeeze a plutonium core with unimaginable force, triggering a nuclear chain reaction. He was a craftsman, working on the trigger of the apocalypse without fully grasping the world-altering nature of the device he was helping to create. In November of 1944, the Army granted him a short leave. David traveled from the surreal, high-security world of Los Alamos back to the familiar streets of New York City. The jarring transition from the stark desert landscape to the close-knit confines of his family's apartment set the stage for the most fateful decision of his life. One evening, his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, sat him down for a serious conversation. The request he made was not framed as treason, but as a moral and political duty. Julius, a fervent and committed agent for the Soviet Union, explained that the Soviets were America's allies in the brutal war against Hitler. He argued that it was fundamentally unfair and dangerous for the United States alone to possess such a weapon of ultimate power. Sharing the secret, he reasoned, would ensure a global balance of power after the war and prevent any single nation from being able to blackmail the rest of the world. He appealed to David's ego, emphasizing how important his work was and how he was uniquely positioned to help their great ally and in turn help secure a more stable future for humanity. David's own wife Ruth was present for this conversation and supported Julius's plea. The pressure was immense, coming from the two people whose approval he valued most. Torn between a vague sense of loyalty to his country and a much more immediate, tangible loyalty to his family, David Greenglass made his choice. He agreed to become a spy. The espionage itself was not a sophisticated affair of clandestine meetings and advanced spycraft. It was clumsy and amateurish. Upon returning to the heavily guarded Los Alamos laboratory, David began to gather information. He was not privy to the highest levels of theoretical physics, but he could provide what he saw and worked on. He made crude drawings from memory of the lens mold assembly and jotted down notes about the key scientists and the layout of the facility. During subsequent visits to New York, he would pass these handwritten notes and messy sketches to Julius. The information was rudimentary, a far cry from a complete blueprint for an atomic bomb. But for the Soviet Union's own scientists who were desperately trying to build their own weapon, these pieces of the puzzle provided by an unassuming machinist at the heart of the project were pure gold. For the next several months, David Greenglass lived a double life: a soldier and a craftsman by day, and a spy for his brother-in-law by night, all while the war marched toward its violent conclusion, unaware that his actions had set in motion a chain of events that would destroy his family and forever stain his name. For a few years after the war, life for David Greenglass settled into a semblance of normalcy. He and his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, went into business together, running a small and perpetually struggling machine shop in New York City. The immense secret David carried seemed to recede, becoming a distant memory of a feverish, ideologically charged time. But the hidden threads of espionage networks are persistent, and justice, however slow, often finds a way to pull on them. The unraveling began thousands of miles away in Great Britain. The brilliant German-born physicist Klaus Fuchs, who had worked at the highest levels of the Manhattan Project, was arrested and confessed to being a long-term Soviet spy. His confession was a bombshell that sent shockwaves through Western intelligence agencies. He had a handler, an American courier, who had shuttled secrets back and forth. Under intense interrogation, Fuchs gave them a name, Harry Gold. Once in custody, Harry Gold, a quiet and unassuming biochemist, began to sing. He meticulously detailed his life as a courier, laying out a map of the Soviet spy ring that stretched across America. As he talked, the dominoes began to fall, each name leading to another. And on his list of contacts was a U.S. Army machinist he had met in New Mexico to collect information about the atomic bomb. In June of 1950, that chain reaction reached David Greenglass's front door. The knock from FBI agents was the sound he had been dreading for 5 years. The abstract political choices he'd made in a New York apartment transformed into the terrifying reality of federal law enforcement and the grave charge of espionage. He was no master spy. He was a mechanic, a husband and a father completely out of his depth and seized by panic. During the interrogation, the agents laid out his options with chilling clarity. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He was facing a long, harsh prison sentence for giving away the nation's most vital military secret during wartime. but they offered him a path to leniency. They were not primarily interested in a lowly machinist. They wanted the organizers, the recruiters, the people who turned loyal Americans into spies. They wanted his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. David was faced with an impossible choice, and in that moment of intense pressure, his loyalty to his country, which had always been vague, was pitted against a more primal instinct, self-preservation. More than that, it was preservation of his own small family. His wife, Ruth, had been an active participant, encouraging his espionage and even helping to facilitate it. The prosecutors had her in their sights as well. The deal became clear. If David cooperated, if he gave them Julius, they would be lenient with him. And most importantly, they would spare his wife from prosecution. For David, the choice was agonizing but ultimately simple. He would save his wife. He began to talk. He confessed his own role completely and pointed directly at Julius Rosenberg as the man who had recruited him and served as the ringleader of his small part of the network. This was a major breakthrough for the government, but they soon realized their case against David's sister Ethel was dangerously thin. They believed she was guilty, but her involvement was based more on association than on concrete actions. The prosecutors, including the notoriously aggressive and ambitious Roy Cohn, were convinced that the only way to make Julius break and confess was to threaten him with the execution of his wife, the mother of his 2 young sons. To do that, they needed more than just suspicion against Ethel. They needed a witness to testify to a specific, overt act of espionage. They turned back to the one man who could provide it, her brother. The trial in 1951 became one of the most sensational legal dramas in American history. The key moment came when David Greenglass took the witness stand to testify against his own sister and her husband. He appeared calm and collected as he recounted how he had passed sketches and notes about the atomic bomb to Julius. Then the prosecutor led him to the crucial question. What happened to those notes? David delivered the fatal blow. He testified that he saw his sister Ethel sitting at a portable typewriter in the Rosenbergs' apartment, transcribing his messy handwritten notes into a clean, usable format for delivery to the Soviets. This single piece of testimony was devastating. It was the linchpin of the prosecution's case against her, transforming her in the jury's eyes from a wife who might have known about her husband's activities into an active and essential participant in the conspiracy. It was the act that sealed her fate. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts, citing the gravity of their crime, which the judge claimed was worse than murder. He sentenced both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to death. The sentence was a shock to many, a brutal and final punishment for a crime that did not directly involve violence. For his cooperation, for providing the testimony that condemned his sister, David Greenglass received a far different fate. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. His wife Ruth, as promised, was never charged. The deal had been honored. David went to prison in 1951, having saved himself and his wife from the worst outcome. But the price was staggering. He had purchased their safety with his sister's life. While he served his time, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg sat on death row, maintaining their innocence through a storm of appeals and protests. The betrayal was complete and unerasable fact of history. In June of 1953, the Rosenbergs were executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison, leaving behind 2 orphaned sons and a brother who would have to live with the consequences of his testimony for the rest of his life. When David Greenglass walked out of federal prison in 1960, having served less than a decade of his 15-year sentence, he stepped into a world that had tried to move on from the raw wounds of his trial. The name Greenglass, however, was not one that could be easily forgotten. It was a name synonymous with betrayal, a name that would forever be linked to the execution of his own sister. For him and his wife Ruth, the woman for whom he had sacrificed his sister, there was only one path forward: to disappear. They changed their names, shed their old identities, and melted back into the vast anonymity of Queens, New York. For decades, they lived a quiet, unremarkable life, raising their children and carefully guarding the secret of their past. David Greenglass, the star witness, the brother who condemned his sister, had vanished from public view. Yet the story he helped write never went away. The Rosenberg case became a permanent fixture in the American consciousness, a bitter and divisive symbol of the Cold War's deepest anxieties. For some, the Rosenbergs were treasonous villains who deserved their fate. For their supporters and their orphaned sons, they were martyrs, victims of a wave of political hysteria. And at the heart of that debate was the unshakable testimony of David Greenglass. While he lived his quiet life under an assumed name, his words from the 1951 trial were endlessly dissected, debated, and questioned. Historians pored over the trial transcripts, and activists cried foul, insisting that his testimony against Ethel had been a lie, a fabrication coached by a government desperate for a conviction. For nearly 50 years, it remained his word against the suspicions of history. David himself remained silent, a ghost haunting the edges of the story. The end of the Cold War in the early 1990s began to pry open old secrets. Decrypted Soviet cables confirmed what the government had long asserted: Julius Rosenberg was indeed an enthusiastic and productive spy. The evidence was undeniable. But these same archives were conspicuously thin on Ethel's role, suggesting her involvement was likely minimal, perhaps only consisting of knowing what her husband was doing. This new historical context set the stage for one final shocking revelation. By the early 2000s, David was an old man. His wife, Ruth, whom he had protected at all costs, had passed away. Perhaps it was his advanced age, or the freedom that came with Ruth's passing, or simply the crushing weight of a half-century-old lie, but David Greenglass finally decided to break his silence. In a series of interviews for the book The Brother, and a segment on national television, the man who had disappeared for decades resurfaced to confess. He admitted in his own plain-spoken and unapologetic words that he had committed perjury on the witness stand. He calmly stated that the most crucial part of his testimony, the story that had sent his sister to the electric chair, was a lie. He could not, he now said, remember who had typed up his espionage notes. He confessed that he had no memory of seeing Ethel at the typewriter. When pressed on why he would invent such a damning detail, his answer was chillingly simple. He told the prosecutors his testimony against Ethel was not strong enough for a conviction, but they insisted he give them more. He felt he had no choice. He lied, he said, to protect his wife Ruth from prosecution and to secure the lenient sentence the government had promised him. It was a cold, calculated transaction. He gave the prosecutors the testimony they needed to condemn his sister, and in return he and his wife were allowed to eventually walk free. The admission was a historical bombshell. It did not change the fact of Julius Rosenberg's guilt, but it fundamentally reframed the tragedy of his wife. It confirmed that the United States government had used perjured testimony, a lie knowingly solicited from a brother against his sister, to secure a death sentence. The confession solidified David's legacy, stripping away any remaining ambiguity. He was not a conflicted patriot who made a difficult choice. He was, by his own account, a man who lied to save himself and his wife, fully aware that the lie would lead to his sister's death. He lived with this final truth for another decade, a frail old man in a nursing home. His death in 2014 at the age of 92 was not even reported for several months, a quiet postscript to a life of loud and tragic consequence. He outlived almost everyone involved, a lonely survivor of a family drama that he had single-handedly turned into one of America's most profound and enduring tragedies. In the end, David Greenglass was granted what his sister was not: a long life. He died an old man, decades after his late-in-life confession confirmed the terrible truth: he had lied, and his lie was fatal. His story serves as a chilling reminder of how personal fears and loyalties can shape major historical events, leaving behind a legacy not of atomic secrets but of profound and irreparable betrayal. The Rosenberg case remains a scar on American history with a brother's treachery at its very heart. For more stories that uncover the hidden truths of the past, make sure you subscribe.